Listen closely. Most people believe that power is forged in gold, in skyscrapers that scrape the belly of heaven, or in signatures on legal documents that move armies. They are mistaken. True power, the kind that alters the fabric of destiny, is much quieter. It is a seed dropped into the mud when no one is watching. I am going to tell you a story about a transaction, not a business deal, but an investment made by a man who had nothing left to give and a boy who had nothing left to lose. It begins not with a triumph, but with the sound of a stomach devouring itself in the silence of a freezing alleyway. And the return on this investment? It was not money. It was a kingdom. The rain in the city of Oakhaven did not wash things clean. It merely pressed the grime deeper into the cobblestones. It was a freezing, iron-tasting rain that seeped through wool and leather, chilling the bones of the wealthy and the poor alike. But for the boy huddled in the alcove between the bakery and the abandoned textile mill, the rain was not just weather. It was a predator. His name was unrecognizable, even to himself. He had been called Rat, Filth, and Youth there for so long that his birth name had evaporated like steam. He was perhaps 10 years old, though his eyes held the haunted, ancient weariness of a man who had seen war. His condition was a masterpiece of misery. His clothes were not garments but a collage of rot, burlap sacks held together by fray and twine, stained with the grease of dumpsters and the mud of the gutters. His skin was translucent, stretched tight over a skeletal frame that looked as though it might shatter if the wind blew too hard. But it was his hands that told the true story. They were raw, covered in weeping sores from digging through the industrial waste of the factory district, searching for scrap metal to sell for a crust of bread. He had not eaten in 3 days. The hunger had passed the stage of pain and entered the stage of hallucination. The smell of baking bread from the shop next door was a cruel torture. He could smell the yeast, the warm butter, the sugar. It made his mouth water, which only made his empty stomach convulse in violent spasms. He sat on a flattened cardboard box, hugging his knees to his chest. He was trying to make himself small, trying to become invisible. In this city, visibility meant danger. It meant the police beating him for loitering, or older street gangs stealing the few copper wires he had scavenged. To survive, one had to be a ghost. As the sun began to set, casting long, bruised shadows across the wet street, the boy saw boots approaching. Expensive boots. Leather, polished to a shine that defied the mud, protected by galoshes. The boy shrank back into the shadows. He held his breath. Walk past. He prayed to a god he wasn't sure existed. Just walk past. But the boots stopped. The owner of the boots was an old man named Arthur Penhaligon. Arthur was a clockmaker, a profession that was slowly dying in a world obsessed with new, disposable technology. Arthur was not rich. In fact, he was currently debating whether he could afford to heat his shop that night or if he should just wear an extra coat. He was tired, his back ached, and his own heart was heavy with the grief of a wife buried 2 winters ago. Arthur looked down. He didn't see a rat. He saw a trembling bundle of rags. He saw a pair of eyes that were wide, terrified, and incredibly blue amidst the grime. Arthur sighed. It was a heavy, rattling sound. He knew he should keep walking. He had barely enough soup for himself back at the shop. Helping a street urchin was a bottomless pit. You feed one, and 10 more appear. That was the logic of the city. But then, the boy coughed. It was a wet, rattling cough that shook his frail body so violently his head banged against the brick wall. He whimpered, a sound so small and broken it pierced through the noise of the rain and the traffic. Arthur's resistance crumbled. He was a man who fixed broken things. He took clocks that had stopped ticking, mechanisms that the world had given up on, and he found a rhythm inside them again. He looked at the boy and saw a broken spring, a gear gemmed by the grit of the world. You, Arthur said, his voice gruff. The boy flinched. shielding his face with his scarred hands, expecting a blow. "Stop that," Arthur commanded gently. He reached into his coat pocket. He didn't have money to spare, but he had something else. He pulled out a warm, foil-wrapped package. It was a meat pasty, bought from the very bakery the boy was leaning against. It was Arthur's dinner. Arthur crouched down, his knees popping. He held the pasty out. The steam rose from it, carrying the scent of beef and pepper. The boy stared at it. He didn't move. It was a trap. It had to be. No one gave something like that away. "Take it," Arthur whispered. "It's not poisoned. Look." Arthur broke a small piece off the crust and popped it into his own mouth, chewing deliberately. "See? I'm still standing." The boy's hand shot out like a striking snake. He snatched the pasty, his fingernails black with dirt, and shoved nearly half of it into his mouth at once. He didn't chew. He inhaled it. He choked, coughed, and kept eating, tears streaming down his face, mixing with the rain and the grime. Arthur watched, a profound sadness settling in his chest. "Slow down, son, you'll make yourself sick." The boy finished the food in seconds. He looked at his empty hands, then up at Arthur. For the first time, the fear receded slightly, replaced by a confused awe. "What is your name?" Arthur asked. The boy tried to speak, but his voice was a rusty hinge. He cleared his throat. "7," he rasped. "7?" Arthur frowned. "That's a number, not a name. 7th bed in the orphanage," the boy whispered. "Before I ran." Arthur nodded slowly. "Well, 7. My name is Arthur, and you cannot stay here tonight. The temperature is dropping. If you sleep here, you won't wake up." 7 tensed. He looked at the street, then back at the alcove. He had nowhere else. Arthur stood up and opened his umbrella. He held it out, not over himself, but over the boy. The sudden absence of the freezing rain hitting his skin made 7 look up in shock. "My shop is 2 blocks away," Arthur said, looking straight ahead. "It is warm. There is a rug by the fire, and I believe I have half a loaf of bread left." He paused. "I am walking there now. You can follow, or you can stay." Arthur began to walk. He moved slowly, giving the boy time. He didn't look back. He counted his steps. 1, 2, 3. He heard the squelch of bare feet on wet pavement. 4, 5. Arthur smiled, a small, sad smile hidden by his collar. The boy was following. They arrived at Penhaligon's horology, a narrow shop squeezed between a loud pub and a dry cleaner. As Arthur unlocked the door, the chime of 100 clocks greeted him, a cacophony of ticks and tucks, a heartbeat of brass and wood. 7 hesitated at the threshold. The shop was warm. It smelled of oil, old wood, and lavender. It smelled safe. "Come in," Arthur said, ushering him inside and locking the world out. That night, Arthur heated water on the hot plate. He found a bucket and some harsh soap. He didn't scrub the boy himself. He allowed 7 his dignity, but he gave him a clean, oversized flannel shirt that had belonged to his late son. When 7 emerged from the back room, he looked like a drowning victim who had just been pulled onto a lifeboat. He was shivering, not from cold, but from the shock of warmth. Arthur pointed to a thick rug near the cast-iron stove. "Sleep," he said. 7 curled up on the rug. It was softer than anything he had ever touched. He watched Arthur sitting at his workbench, illuminated by a single green lamp, tweezers in hand, working on the delicate hairspring of a pocket watch. The rhythmic tick-tick-tick of the clocks was hypnotic. For the first time in years, the boy's adrenaline faded. His eyelids grew heavy. "Why?" 7 whispered into the darkness. Arthur didn't look up from his work. "Why what?" "Why me?" Arthur paused. He set down his tweezers. He turned on his stool and looked at the small, broken boy on his rug. "Because," Arthur said softly, "a clock that is dirty and broken is not useless. 7. It is just waiting for someone to wind it." Arthur turned back to his work. 7 watched the old man's back until the darkness took him, and for the first time in his life, he dreamed of something other than running. You might assume that genius announces itself with a shout. A sudden breakthrough, a eureka moment screamed from a bathtub. But in the dusty, ticking silence of Penhaligon's horology, genius arrived on tiptoes. It arrived without a single spoken word. For the first 3 weeks, the boy named 7 was not an apprentice. He was a ghost that Arthur Penhaligon had allowed to haunt his shop. 7 moved through the narrow aisles of the shop with the skittish wariness of a stray cat. When the doorbell chimed, signaling a customer, he would vanish into the back room before the door even opened. When Arthur spoke to him, he would nod or shake his head, his blue eyes wide and unblinking, tracking Arthur's hands rather than his face. He ate voraciously. He slept curled in a ball so tight it looked painful. And he watched. My God, how he watched! Arthur would sit at his workbench, the magnifying loupe screwed into his eye, dismantling the escapement of a carriage clock. He could feel the boy's gaze burning into the back of his neck. At first, it unnerved him. Arthur was used to solitude. Having an audience for his failing eyesight and trembling hands felt like a judgment. Arthur's arthritis was a cruel roommate. It flared in the damp weather, turning his fingers into stiff, uncooperative claws. There were days when he would drop a screw no larger than a grain of sand and spend 20 minutes on his hands and knees, cursing softly, trying to find it in the floorboards. It was on one such Tuesday, a great and miserable afternoon, that the dynamic changed. Arthur was working on a French mantel clock, a temperamental thing from the 1890s. His tweezers slipped. A ruby bearing, a tiny, crucial jewel, pinged off the brass casing and vanished into the cluttered abyss of the workshop floor. Arthur let out a groan of pure frustration. He gripped the edge of a bench, his knuckles white. "Blast it all," he whispered, the defeat heavy in his voice. He began a painful process of lowering himself off his stool. Suddenly, a small, scarred hand entered his field of vision. 7 didn't look at Arthur. He dropped to his knees, his cheek pressed almost against the floorboards. He froze, scanning the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light from the window. He looked like a hawk scanning a field for a mouse. 3 seconds later, 7's hand darted out. He pinched something invisible between his thumb and forefinger. He stood up and placed the ruby bearing gently onto the velvet pad of Arthur's workbench. Arthur stared at the jewel, then at the boy. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with surprise. 7 didn't smile. He simply pointed to the tweezers in Arthur's hand, then to the clock. It was a command, continue. From that day on, the silence between them stopped being a wall and became a bridge. Arthur began to narrate his work. He didn't know if the boy understood the technical terms, but he spoke them anyway, perhaps just to fill the air. "This is the mainspring," Arthur would say, holding up a coiled strip of steel. "It is that heart. It stores the energy. If this snaps, the time dies." 7 would nod, his eyes locking onto the spring. "This is the escapement," Arthur explained the next day, pointing to a toothed wheel rocking back and forth. "It is the brain. It tells the energy how fast to release. Tick, tock. Control is everything. 7. Power without control is just an explosion." 7 seemed to vibrate when he looked at the gears. It was as if the internal rhythm of the machines resonated with something deep inside his own broken psyche. The chaos of the world, the hunger, the cold, the cruelty, had no logic. But a clock made sense. Cause and effect. Order. The true test came 2 months later in the form of the Harrison repeater. It belonged to the mayor, a pompous man who valued punctuality above kindness. The clock was a pocket watch of exquisite complexity, capable of chiming the hour and the minute at the press of a button. It had stopped working 3 years ago. 3 other watchmakers had failed to fix it. Arthur needed the money from this repair to pay the heating bill. He spent a week staring at the movement, his brow furrowed. The mechanism was a labyrinth of levers and cams, packed so tightly together that a human breath seemed likely to disturb them. For 3 nights, Arthur worked until his eyes watered and his hands shook uncontrollably. He couldn't find the fault. The logic eluded him. He was too old, his mind too cluttered with the debris of a long, hard life. On the 4th night, Arthur threw his tools down. "I can't do it," he muttered to the empty shop. He put his head in his hands. "I'm finished." He shuffled upstairs to his small apartment, the weight of failure crushing his chest. He left the Harrison repeater disassembled on the bench, a corpse of brass and steel. Downstairs, in the shadows, Seven opened his eyes. The boy rose from his rug. The shop was lit only by the street lamps outside, casting long, distorted shadows across the workbench. Seven climbed onto Arthur's stool. His feet didn't touch the ground. He looked at the scattered parts of the watch. To anyone else, it was a mess. To Seven, it was a puzzle waiting to be solved. He picked up the tweezers. They were heavy in his hand. He didn't know the names of the parts like Arthur did. He didn't know the history of the Harrison escapement. He only knew the shape of things. He saw the geometry. He saw that one tiny lever, bent by a fraction of a millimeter, was catching on a gear. It wasn't broken. It was just misunderstood. Seven worked. He didn't notice the cold. He didn't notice the passage of time. He entered a trance state, a place of pure, silent focus where the only thing that existed was the interaction of metal on metal. His breathing slowed to match the rhythm of the pendulums on the wall. He adjusted the lever. He polished a pivot with a scrap of leather. He reassembled the plates, his fingers moving with a dexterity that was almost supernatural. When the sun began to bleed gray light through the front window, Seven tightened the final screw on the case. He pressed the button on the side of the watch. Ding, 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 the clear, bell-like tone rang out in the silence shop. Seven placed the watch in the center of the velvet pad. Then, he curled up on his rug and fell instantly asleep. When Arthur came downstairs the next morning, he looked like a man marching to his execution. He prepared himself to pack up the pieces of the mayor's watch and admit defeat. He froze. The watch was assembled. It sat shining in the morning light. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. He approached the bench slowly, as if the watch were a bomb. He picked it up. He held it to his ear. Tick, 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 tick. A strong, healthy, rhythmic heartbeat. Arthur pressed the repeater button. The watch chimed the time perfectly. 7:32. Arthur spun around. Seven was sitting up on the rug, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He looked small, fragile, and utterly ordinary. "You?" Arthur whispered. "You did this?" Seven hugged his knees. He looked anxious, waiting for a reprimand for touching the tools. Arthur looked at the watch, then back at the boy. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't harboring a charity case. He was harboring a prodigy. The boy saw things Arthur could no longer see. The boy had an innate understanding of the mechanics of the universe. Arthur walked over to the rug. He didn't kneel this time. He stood tall, treating the boy not as a child, but as an equal. 7 is a number, Arthur said, his voice trembling slightly. It is cold. It is mathematical. It is not a name for a maker. The boy looked up. "My middle name is Julian," Arthur said. "It was my father's name. He was a good man. He could fix anything, but he couldn't fix a broken heart. You have fixed mine." Arthur extended a hand. "Julian," Arthur said firmly, "that is what you are. Julian vents. Because you have advanced beyond anything I could teach you in a single night. The boy hesitated. He tasted the sound of it in his mind. Julian. It didn't sound like the name of a rat in an alley. It sounded like the name of someone who mattered. He reached out and took the old man's hand. Julian, the boy whispered. And in that handshake, the contract was signed. Not with ink, but with grease and gratitude. The master had found his apprentice, and the apprentice had found his father. The clocks on the wall continued to tick, counting down the time toward a future neither of them could possibly imagine. Time is a cruel accountant. It keeps a ledger that can never be balanced. For every moment of perfect happiness, it charges a tax of eventual loss. For 2 years, Arthur Penhaligon and Julian Vance had lived in a bubble of borrowed time, pretending that the debt would never come due. The shop had transformed. It was no longer a dusty mausoleum of dying machines. It had become a place of minor miracles. People whispered about Penhaligon's horology. They said that Arthur had found a second wind, a magical touch that could resurrect watches crushed by tanks or clocks drowned in floods. They didn't know about the boy in the back room, the shadow with the steady hands who worked while the city slept. Julian was 12 now. He had filled out, his skeletal frame covered by the lean muscle of a growing boy. The fear in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, intense intelligence. He no longer flinched when Arthur raised a hand. He knew that hand only offered tools or food. They had a routine. Tea at 8 a.m., work until noon, soup and bread, lessons in mathematics and physics in the afternoon, Arthur teaching from old, crumbling textbooks, Julian absorbing the information like a sponge in water. But happiness makes noise, and in Oakhaven, noise attracts predators. It began on a Thursday, the kind of day where the sky looks like a bruised plum. The bell above the door chimed, not with its usual cheerful greeting, but with a dull, heavy clank. Arthur looked up from the counter. Standing in the doorway was a man who looked as though he had been carved out of gristle and gray law books. He wore a damp trench coat and a bowler hat. His eyes were small, bead-like, and devoid of warmth. Julian, sensing the shift in the air pressure of the room, had already vanished behind the velvet curtain into the workshop. "Arthur Penhaligon?" the man asked. His voice sounded like gravel being crushed under a boot. "I am he," Arthur said, straightening his back. He wiped his oil-stained hands on a rag. "How can I help you?" The man didn't step forward. He simply reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "My name is Silas Grist. I represent the Department of Wardship and Juvenile Correction." The air left the room. Arthur felt his heart skip a beat, a terrifying arrhythmia that had nothing to do with his age. I don't know what you mean," Arthur stammered. Grist smiled. It was a facial expression that involved showing teeth but no joy. "Don't play the fool, Mr. Penhaligon. It is beneath a man of your standing. We know the boy is here. 7, I believe he was designated. Property of the St. Jude's orphanage. There is no boy here," Arthur lied. It was a weak lie, fragile as glass. Grist stepped into the shop. He looked around, his eyes scanning the floorboards, noting the second set of footprints in the dust, the extra mug on the counter. "We have reports," Grist said softly. "Neighbors seeing a child in the window. A supplier mentioning an apprentice. You are breaking the law, Arthur. Harboring a runaway is a felony. Kidnapping is worse. I didn't kidnap anyone." Arthur's voice rose, cracking with indignation. He was starving. He was dying in the gutter like an animal. "And he remains the property of the state," Grist countered, his voice flat. He placed the document on the counter. "This is a warrant. I am feeling generous today, Arthur. I will give you until tomorrow morning to surrender the boy. If he is not outside this door at 9 a.m., I will return with the constabulary. You will be arrested. This shop will be seized to pay your fines. You will die in a cell. Gris tapped the paper with a gloved finger. 9 a.m. Tick-tock, Mr. Penhaligon. The man turned and left. The bell chimed again, sounding like a funeral toll. Arthur stood frozen. He stared at the door for a long time. Then, his knees gave way. He collapsed onto the stool behind the counter, burying his face in his hands. From behind the curtain, Julian emerged. He made no sound. He walked over to Arthur and placed a hand on the old man's shaving shoulder. "I heard," Julian whispered. Arthur looked up. His eyes were red, filled with a panic that Julian had never seen before. "I won't let them tick you," Arthur rasped. "We'll fight it. I know a lawyer. Old man Henderson down the street. We can hide you in the cellar until it blows over." Julian looked at Arthur. He saw the love in the old man's face, but he also saw the truth. Arthur was old. He was frail. A prison cell would kill him in a week. Losing the shop, his life's work, his legacy, would kill his spirit even faster. Julian realized then that love was not just about holding on. Sometimes, the most brutal form of love was letting go. "Okay," Julian lied. "We will talk to Henderson in the morning." Arthur exhaled, a ragged sound of relief. He gripped Julian's hand. "We are a team, Julian, you and me. We fix things." "Yes," Julian said, his voice steady. "We fix things." That night, the rain returned. It hammered against the roof tiles, a relentless drumming that masked the creak of floorboards. Arthur slept fitfully, murmuring in his dreams. Downstairs, Julian moved through the shop like a phantom. He didn't take much. He couldn't. He packed a small canvas bag with a loaf of bread, a bottle of water, and the spare wool sweater Arthur had bought him. He stood before the workbench. This was his altar. This was where he had learned that he was not garbage, but a creator. He reached out and took a single tool, a set of fine-point precision tweezers. They were old, the brass worn smooth by Arthur's father, then Arthur, and finally Julian. They were the baton passed in a relay race that was about to be interrupted. Julian found a piece of heavy cardstock and a fountain pen. He sat at the bench where he had learned to write. He wanted to write a book. He wanted to tell Arthur that he loved him, that he had saved his life, that he was the only father he would ever know. But the words were too big for the paper. They got stuck in his throat. Instead, he wrote a promise, a transaction, an investment. He placed the note on the velvet pad, right where the morning light would hit it. Julian walked to the front door. He unlocked it. The wind howled, trying to push him back inside, trying to keep him safe. He looked back one last time. He memorized the smell of the oil and the lavender. He memorized the rhythm of the clocks, 1,000 heartbeats that he would carry in his chest forever. "Goodbye, Papa," he whispered into the dark. He stepped out into the rain. The door clicked shut. When Arthur awoke the next morning, the silence was heavy. It was a different kind of silence than before. It wasn't peaceful. It was hollow. "Julian," he called out, his voice trembling. He hurried downstairs, his heart hammering against his ribs. The shop was empty. The rug by the stove was cold. "Julian," he screamed, tearing the curtain aside. Empty. Arthur ran to the front door. It was unlocked. He threw it open and looked out into the wet, gray street. There was nothing but puddles and the indifference of the city. He stumbled back inside, grief clawing at his throat. He went to the workbench, looking for a sign, a clue, anything. He saw the cardstock. Arthur picked it up with shaking hands. He read the words, written in Julian's precise, architectural handwriting. "Greater than do not look for me. They will hurt you if you find me. I am going where the gears are big enough to hide me. Thank you for the name. Thank you for the life. Greater than one day, I will return. I will fix the biggest clock in the world for you. Greater than Julian. Arthur Penhaligon fell to his knees. He clutched the note to his chest and wept, a sound of utter devastation that was lost in the ticking of the clocks. Outside, the rain washed away the footprints of the boy who had become invisible once again, leaving only the echo of a promise hanging in the mist. If you want to kill a man without using the weapon, you don't need poison or a bullet. You simply take away his utility. You make him obsolete. You let the world spin a little faster than his legs can carry him until he is left standing still, watching the backs of everyone else fading into the distance. 20 years is not a long time in the history of the universe. It is a blink of a cosmic eye. But in the life of a technology, 20 years is an epoch. And in the life of a lonely old man, it is a sentence. Oakhaven had changed. The cobblestones were gone, paved over with smooth, soulless asphalt. The gas lamps had been replaced by harsh LED streetlights that bleached the color out of the night. The textile mill where Julian used to scavenge for scrap was now the block of glass-fronted luxury apartments called the Lofts. And Penhaligon's horology? It was a scar on a perfect face. The shop was the only unrenovated building on the block. The paint was peeling in long, gray strips like dead skin. The golden lettering on the window, Arthur Penhaligon, master watchmaker, had flaked away, leaving only her on Ligon, stir maker. Inside, the symphony of ticking had died. Arthur sat in his chair behind the counter. He was 82 years old, but he looked 100. His spine had curved, pulling him permanently toward the earth. His hair was wispy and white, like dandelion fluff waiting for a strong wind. But the greatest tragedy was his hands. Those hands, which had once performed microsurgery on gears the size of a gnat's eye, were now twisted knots of arthritis. The joints were swollen and red. They trembled constantly, a rhythmic shaking that he could not stop. He was a conductor who could no longer hold the baton. The shop was freezing. The radiator had broken 3 years ago, and Arthur couldn't afford the parts to fix it. He wore 3 sweaters and a scarf indoors. His breath misted in the air, a small, ghostly fog that appeared and disappeared with every laboring lungful. He stared at the shelf opposite him. It used to be filled with clocks awaiting repair. Now, it held only dust. Thick, gray blankets of dust. Nobody fixed clocks anymore. First, it was the batteries. Cheap, quartz watches that you threw away when they stopped. Then, it became the screens. Everyone had a phone. Everyone had a computer on their wrist that measured their heart rate, their steps, their emails. Nobody needed to spring to tell them the time. They didn't want time. They wanted data. The bell above the door remained silent. It hadn't rung in 11 days. Arthur looked down at the envelope on the counter. It wasn't a love letter. It was a formal notice from the city council, stamped with red ink. Notice of eminent domain. The building was to be condemned. A developer wanted to knock it down to build a parking structure for the luxury apartments next door. He had 30 days to vacate. 30 days. Arthur reached out to pick up his tea mug. His hand shook violently. The mug rattled against the saucer, spilling brown liquid onto the counter. Useless, Arthur whispered. His voice was like dry leaves scraping together. Useless old fool. He wiped the spill with a dirty rag. He had no money for the movers. He had no family to take him in. When they came for the building, he would simply have to sit here and let the bulldozers take him too. He looked at the empty workbench where Julian used to sit. For 20 years, Arthur had waited. Every time the door opened, his heart would leap, hoping to see a young man with blue eyes and scarred hands. But it was always a customer complaining about a price, or a mailman, or nobody at all. Julian hadn't come back. He'd forgotten you, a dark voice whispered in Arthur's ear. He went out into the big world and he realized you were just a stepping stone. You were just a warm room and a meal. No, Arthur said aloud to the empty room. He promised. But promises, like clocks, rust if they aren't maintained. Arthur stood up, wincing as his knees popped. He needed to do something. The silence was driving him mad. He needed to hear a tick. Just one tick. He shuffled over to the back wall, to the grandfather clock that had belonged to his father. It was a majestic beast of mahogany and brass. It hadn't run in 5 years because Arthur didn't have the strength to pull the heavy iron weights up the chains. One last time, Arthur grunted. He opened the glass door. He reached for the chain. He wrapped his gnarled fingers around the brass ring. Keep hold. Pain shot through his shoulder, hot and sharp. His grip failed. His hand slipped. The heavy weight plummeted down, crashing into the bottom of the clock case with a deafening boom. The sound echoed through the shop like a gunshot. Arthur recoiled, losing his balance. He fell backward, hitting the floor hard. Dust billowed up around him, choking him. He lay there on the cold floorboards, staring up at the ceiling. The water-damaged stains looked like maps of countries that didn't exist. He tried to get up, but his body refused. The cold seeped into his bones instantly. This is it, he thought. This is how it ends. Not with a bang, but with a fall in a dusty room, defeated by a clock he couldn't want. Tears leaked from the corners of his milky eyes, tracking hot paths through the grime on his face. Julian, he whimpered. I'm sorry. I couldn't keep it waiting for you. I let the time run out. He closed his eyes. He was tired. So very tired. It would be easy to just sleep here. To let the cold take him. It would be peaceful. Knock. 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 The sound was sharp and rhythmic. It came from the front door. Arthur's eyes flew open. He held his breath. Knock. 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 It wasn't the wind. Someone was there. Arthur groaned, rolling onto his side. He used the edge of the workbench to haul himself up, inch by painful inch. He stood, swaying, brushing the dust from his sleeves. We're closed, he yelled, his voice cracking. Go away. There's nothing here. The knocking stopped. Then, a piece of paper slid under the door. It wasn't a white envelope like the eviction notice. It was thick, cream-colored cardstock. Heavy. Expensive. Arthur stared at it. Curiosity, that old and dangerous instinct, flickered in his chest. He shuffled to the door. He bent down, a process that took a full 10 seconds of agony, and picked up the envelope. There was no stamp, no return address. Just his name, written in gold calligraphy that shimmered in the gloom. Mr. Arthur Penhaligon. He tore it open with his teeth because his fingers were too stiff. Inside was a single ticket. It was made of a material Arthur had never touched before, smooth, like glass, but flexible like paper. It glowed faintly with an inner light. Passenger, Arthur Penhaligon, destination, AION Tower, New Genesis class, platinum date, tomorrow, and clipped to the ticket was a handwritten note. The handwriting was not calligraphic. It was precise, architectural, geometric. Arthur stopped breathing. He knew that handwriting. He had taught the hand that wrote it. He held the note up to the dim light of the window. Greater than the biggest clock in the world is finished, Papa. Come and wind it. Arthur stared at the paper. The tears returned, but this time they were not cold. They were hot. They were the melting of winter ice. He looked around the dead shop. He looked at the eviction notice on the counter. He looked at the broken grandfather clock. He let out a laugh. It was a rusty, wheezing sound, but it was a laugh. You scoundrel, Arthur whispered, a smile breaking through the mask of his misery. You kept me waiting. He didn't know what the AION Tower was. He didn't know where New Genesis was. He didn't know if he could even survive the trip. But for the first time in 20 years, Arthur Penhaligon wasn't looking at the past. He was looking at the future. He put the ticket in his pocket, right next to his heart. There is a specific kind of fear that attacks the poor when they are suddenly thrust into the world of the wealthy. It is not the fear of physical danger. It is the fear of staining the upholstery. It is the fear that you smell like yesterday's soup, and that everyone around you smells like ozone and expensive soap. Arthur Penhaligon spent his last morning in Oakhaven trying to scrub the oil stains from his fingers with a bar of harsh lye soap. It was a futile gesture. The oil was not on his skin. It was in his skin, tattooed into the whorls of his fingerprints by 60 years of labor. He dressed in his Sunday best, a charcoal wolf suit he had purchased for his wife's funeral. It hung loosely on his shrunken frame. The cuffs were frayed, and there was a small, shiny patch on the elbow where the fabric had worn thin. He looked like a scarecrow dressed by a mortician. He packed a single leather satchel. Inside, he placed a change of socks, a photograph of his wife, the note from Julian, and his tool roll. He didn't know why he packed the tools. His hands shook too much to hold a screwdriver, let alone use it. But a soldier does not walk onto the battlefield without his rifle, even if he has no bullets. At 8 a.m. sharp, the air outside his shop began to vibrate. It wasn't a sound, exactly. It was a hum, deep and resonant, that rattled the teacups on the shelf. Arthur walked to the door and opened it. The street, usually occupied by garbage trucks and puddle-splashing taxis, was dominated by a machine that defied gravity. It was a vehicle of matte black metal and dark glass, shaped like a teardrop. It hovered 6 inches above the cracked pavement, emitting a soft, blue pulse from its undercarriage. There were no wheels. There were no rivets. It looked less like a car and more like a hole cut out of reality. A crowd had gathered. The residents of Oakhaven, people who usually walked with their heads down, were staring slack-jawed. The door of the craft hissed open, sliding upward like a beetle's wing. A man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in a uniform of crisp gray synthetic fabric. He wore no hat, but he wore a pair of silver spectacles that seemed to shimmer with digital data. "Mr. Penhaligon?" the man asked. His voice was polite, modulated, and utterly devoid of judgment. Arthur stepped onto the sidewalk. He felt every eye on him. He clutched his battered satchel tighter. I am. My name is Unit 4 Beta. I am your transport to the launch site. Please." He gestured to the open door. Arthur hesitated. He looked at his dirty shop window one last time. He looked at the reflection of the old man staring back at him. "You don't belong in that car," the reflection said. "You belong in the dust." Arthur straightened his tie. Right then, he muttered. He climbed inside. The interior smelled of nothing. Not clean, but an absolute absence of scent. The seats were made of a white leather that molded instantly to Arthur's aching back, supporting his spine in a way that made them let out an involuntary groan of relief. "Destination, New Genesis," the driver said. The world outside blurred. They didn't drive. They accelerated. The G-force pressed Arthur gently into the seat. He watched through the tinted glass as Oakhaven, the city that had chewed him up and spit him out, dissolved into a smear of gray and brown. Within 20 minutes, they were at the private airfield. Arthur was ushered from the car onto a sleek, silver aircraft that looked like a dagger. He was the only passenger. As the jet roared into the sky, punching through the layer of smog that permanently covered the old world, Arthur saw something he hadn't seen in decades. The sun. It was blindingly bright, gleaming off the sea of white clouds below. Arthur pressed his forehead against the cool glass. He wept quietly. He wept for the beauty of it, and he wept because he wished he could tell his wife that the sun was still there, that it hadn't burned out after all. A stewardess, or perhaps a very advanced android. Arthur couldn't tell. Placed a tray in front of him. Roast chicken, sir. Rosemary potatoes. And the pot of Earl Grey. Steep time 3 minutes, exactly as you prefer. Arthur stared at the food. How did you know? Mr. Vance was very specific about the menu. She smiled. Arthur picked up the fork. It was heavy, real silver. He took a bite of the chicken. It was hot, savory, and tender. He ate slowly, savoring every molecule of flavor. For 20 years, he had eaten to survive. Today, he was eating to live. The flight lasted 4 hours. They crossed the great ocean, leaving the old continents behind. We are beginning our descent, the pilot's voice announced. Welcome to New Genesis. Arthur looked out the window. His breath fogged the glass. Rising out of the blue ocean was an island, but it was not made of earth and stone. It was a geometric miracle, a city built on a massive, artificial platform, gleaming white and silver. It looked like a computer chip grown to the size of a metropolis. There were no smokestacks, no slums, just spiraling towers of glass that twisted toward the heavens, connected by tubes of light where trains zipped back and forth like firing neurons. And in the center of it all, piercing the sky like a needle, was the AI tower. It was black, creating the stark contrast to the white city. It was the tallest structure Arthur had ever seen. It didn't look like a building, it looked like a monolith. The jet landed on a private pad near the summit of the tower. The wind whipped Arthur's thin hair as he stepped out. The air here was thin, crisp, and smelled of ozone in the sea. He was met by a woman with a tablet. Mr. Penhaligon, welcome to AI Industries. Mr. Vance is in the observation deck. He is expecting you. Arthur was led to an elevator. There were no buttons. The doors closed, and he felt a sensation of weightlessness. The floor indicator on the wall didn't count numbers. It just rapidly escalated through altitudes. 1,000 feet, 2,000 feet, 3,000 feet. The doors opened. Arthur stepped out into a room that was the size of a cathedral. The walls were made entirely of glass. The view was terrifying and magnificent. The curvature of the earth was visible on the horizon. The clouds were below them. The room was filled with servers, towering banks of blinking blue lights, humming with the noise of 1 billion calculations per second. And at the far end of the room, standing with his back to Arthur, looking out at the endless sky, was a man. He wore a suit that cost more than Arthur's entire shop. It was tailored to perfection. He stood tall, his posture commanding, his hands clasped behind his back. Arthur stood at the entrance, clutching his battered tool bag. He felt small. He felt like a speck of dust in a sterile laboratory. He cleared his throat. It was a dry, clicking sound. The man at the window turned around. He was older now, 32 years old. His face had hardened, the baby fat gone, replaced by the sharp angles of adulthood. He had a beard, trimmed close, but the eyes were the same. Those piercing, intelligent, blue eyes. And the hands. Arthur looked at the man's hands. They were resting by his sides. They were still scarred. Faint white lines crossed the knuckles, souvenirs from the days of digging through sharp metal in the rain. The man didn't smile. He stared at Arthur with an intensity that made the air crackle. He looked at the fraying suit. He looked at the worn shoes. He looked at the trembling hands. Then, the CEO of the most powerful company on earth walked across the room. He didn't walk like a king. He walked like a boy running home. He stopped 2 feet in front of Arthur. "You look terrible, Papa," Julian said softly. Arthur let out a wet, shaky laugh. "You look expensive, Julian." Julian's composure cracked. The mask of the CEO fell away. He reached out and pulled the frail old man into a crushing hug. Arthur dropped his bag. He wrapped his twisted arms around the man's waist. He smelled of expensive cologne and Beneath that, the faint, nostalgic scent of machine oil. I thought you forgot. Arthur sobbed into Julian's chest. I thought you forgot. I never forgot, Julian whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He pulled back and held Arthur by the shoulders. I just needed time. I needed to build something worthy of you. Julian turned and swept his hand toward the massive glass wall, toward the black tower, toward the city below. You taught me that a clock is just a machine that brings order to chaos, Julian said, so I built a bigger machine. But it's missing one thing. What? Arthur wiped his eyes with his sleeve. It has no heart, Julian said. It has a brain. It has power. But it has no heartbeat. It doesn't know why it ticks. Julian took Arthur's gnarled hand and placed it on the glass panel of the wall. I built the case, Arthur, but you are the mainspring. I didn't bring you here to look at the view. Julian looked deep into the old man's eyes. I brought you here because the AI in tower, it's broken, and nobody else knows how to fix it. The elevator descended, but not to the ground. It stopped somewhere in the middle, in the thoracic cavity of the great beast that was the AI in tower. You said the tower is broken, Arthur said, clutching his tool bag as the door slid open. It doesn't look broken. It looks inevitable. It's suffering from an arrhythmia, Julian replied, stepping out into a corridor that hummed with a low, sub-bass vibration. And in a system this size, a skipped beat doesn't just mean a pause. It means catastrophe. They walked through the headquarters of AI and Industries. To Arthur, it felt less like a workplace and more like the inside of a microchip. The walls were translucent screens displaying streams of data, stock prices, energy consumption rates, weather patterns, shipping logistics. The employees walked with a hurried, terrified efficiency. They didn't speak. They messaged. They didn't walk. They power walked. Their eyes were glazed over, fixed on the augmented reality lenses they all wore. They aren't efficient, Arthur noted, a hint of sadness in his voice. Like ears that have been oiled too much. No friction, but no grip either. That is the problem, Julian said, stopping in front of a massive set of double doors made of blast-proof steel. I built New Genesis to be a utopia of efficiency. We eliminated waste. We eliminated waiting. We automated traffic, currency, even law enforcement. But I forgot the first law of horology. Arthur looked up at his former apprentice. Which is, that a clock must breathe, Julian recited. Energy in, energy out. Tension and release. If you wind to spring too tight, it doesn't run longer. It snaps. Julian placed his palm against the steel door. A laser scanned his retinal pattern. The heavy locks disengaged with a sound like a thunderclap. Thud clank. The door swung open. Arthur gasped. He expected another server room. He expected blinking lights and cooling fans. Instead, he was looking at a cathedral of brass. The room was vast, spanning 3 stories in height. And filling the center of this space was a machine of breathtaking complexity. It was a clock movement, but scaled up to the size of a house. Massive gears the size of dinner tables hung suspended in a framework of titanium. A pendulum, heavy enough to crush a tank, hung motionless in the center. It was a mechanical heart, built with modern materials but designed with ancient principles. The AI in core, Julian whispered, his voice echoing in the silent chamber. The quantum processors that run this city, they are too fast. They calculate probabilities so quickly that they detach from linear time. They drift. The systems desynchronize. The lights flicker. Trains derail. The city is having a nervous breakdown because it thinks too fast to live in the present. Julian walked to the railing of the catwalk. He pointed down at the silent, golden behemoth. I realized I needed a governor, Julian explained. A master clock. A purely mechanical, physical anchor to tie the digital mind to the physical reality. Something that ticks at exactly 1 second, No more, no less. Something to tell the computer, this is now. Arthur walked to the railing. He stared at the gears. He recognized the design. It was a Graham deadbeat escapement, a design from 1715, but reimagined with beryllium and carbon fiber. It is magnificent, Arthur breathed. It is useless, Julian spat, gripping the rail. I built it perfectly. The tolerances are within a nanometer. The balance is absolute. But it won't run. Won't run. I start it, and it stops after 10 minutes. Every time. I have run simulations. I have checked the friction coefficients. I have replaced the pallet jewels. It should run for 1,000 years. But it dies. Julian looked at Arthur, his eyes desperate. It has no soul, Papa. It's just metal. Arthur looked at the giant, silent machine. He looked at the perfect, shiny surfaces of the gears. He looked at the sterile white floor beneath it. He set his leather satchel down on the metal grating. Help me down there, Arthur said. It's dangerous, Julian warned. If that pendulum swings, it carries 10 tons of force. It's not swinging, is it? Arthur snapped, a spark of his old authority returning. Take me to the escapement. They took a service lift down to the floor level. Arthur walked up to the escapement mechanism. It was at eye level, a complex interaction of a toothed wheel and 2 ruby pallets the size of bricks. Arthur reached into his bag. He didn't take out a wrench. He took out his old, oil-stained magnifying loupe. He screwed it into his thigh. He shuffled closer to the machine. He reached out with a trembling hand and touched the escape wheel. It was cold. Sterile. Start it, Arthur commanded. Julian hesitated, then tapped a command into his rest computer. Initiating hydraulic impulse. A hiss of air. The massive pendulum began to swing. Whoosh, whoosh, the escape wheel turned. The pallet clicked into place. Tick. The sound was loud, sharp, and harsh. It echoed off the metal walls like a gunshot. Talk. Arthur closed his eyes. He listened. He didn't listen to the volume. He listened to the feeling. Tick, tock, tick, tock. It was perfect. Mathematically perfect. The rhythm was absolute. And that was why it was wrong. Stop it, Arthur said after 2 minutes. It's running fine, Julian argued. It will stop in 8 minutes. Watch. I said stop it. Arthur yelled over the noise. Julian cut the power. The pendulum slowly lost momentum and died. Silence returned to the room. Arthur sighed. He wiped the sweat from his forehead. He turned to Julian. You built a monument to perfection, Julian, but time isn't perfect. Arthur pointed to the pallet jewels, the contact points where the metal met the stone. It's too clean, Arthur said. You have these gears running in a vacuum-sealed room, lubricated with synthetic hyperfluids. There is no friction. There is no struggle. Friction is the enemy, Julian countered, reverting to the CEO. Friction causes wear. Friction is inefficiency. Friction is life. Arthur grabbed Julian's lapel with a strength that surprised them both. Why do you think the heart beats, Julian? Because it is fighting to push blood. Why do we survive? Because we fight against the cold. You are trying to impose a mathematical ideal on a physical world. Arthur turned back to the machine. You treated this clock like a computer. You made it logically flawless. But a clock is a physical thing. It needs to settle. It needs to wear in. It needs to find its own rhythm, not the one you programmed into it. Arthur reached into his bag again. He pulled out a small, battered tin can. It was rusted around the rim. Julian stared at it. What is that? Well, oil, Arthur said, from the 19th century. My grandfather left it to me. It smells terrible. It's thick. It's organic. You can't put that in there. Julian looked horrified. That machine is worth $4 billion. That oil is full of impurities. Exactly, Arthur smiled. A mischievous, wise smile. It has ghosts in it. Arthur dipped a small brush into the thick, amber sludge. He stepped up to the massive, gleaming escape wheel. The pallet stones are hitting too hard because they are slipping too fast, Arthur murmured, more to the machine than to Julian. They are sliding on your fancy synthetic ice. They need grip. They need to shake hands, not high-five. With a trembling hand, Arthur painted a thin, microscopic layer of the old, smelly oil onto the face of the impulse jewel. He moved to the pivot of the pendulum. He applied a dab of the goo. The room smelled suddenly of old libraries and the deep ocean. It smelled of history. Arthur capped the tin and put it away. He wiped his hands on his trousers. He looked at the machine. It looked the same, but now it had a scent. Julian, Arthur said softly, you are trying to control the city from the top down. You are forcing the time. You have to let the time flow. He stepped back. Give it a push. A manual push. Not with the hydraulics. With your hand. Julian looked at the oil on the billion-dollar gear. He looked at the old man who was shrinking inside his suit. Julian took off his suit jacket. He rolled up his sleeves, revealing the scars on his forearms. He stepped up to the massive pendulum bob. It weighed as much as a car. He placed his hands on the cold metal. He braced his feet. For you, Papa, Julian whispered. He shoved. The heavy weight swung out. Gravity caught it. It swung back. The escape wheel turned. The oil-coated jewel met the tooth of the gear. Throom-click. It wasn't a sharp tick anymore. It was a softer, deeper sound. A sound with texture. A sound with a heartbeat. Throom-clack. Throom-click. Arthur closed his eyes and nodded, his head bobbing to the rhythm. There, he whispered. Do you hear it? It's not marching anymore. It's dancing. They stood there for 10 minutes. Then 20. Then an hour. The machine didn't stop. The vibration of the pendulum began to hum through the floor, traveling up the steel beams, up through the elevator shaft, radiating out into the glass city. High above, in the control room, a red warning light on the main dashboard flickered and turned green. The energy grid stabilized. The flicker in the light ceased. Down in the cathedral of brass, Julian Vance, the richest man in the world, sank to the floor, leaning his back against the railing. He watched the pendulum swing, hypnotized. Arthur sat down beside him, groaning as his joints protested. You see, Julian, Arthur said, resting his head on his apprentice's shoulder. You can build the future, but you'll have to lubricate it with the past. The silence that followed the fixing of the AI and core was not empty, it was heavy with resonance. The massive pendulum continued to swing, sending a rhythmic, subterranean pulse through the soles of their shoes. Throom-clack, throom-clack. It was the sound of a giant sleeping peacefully. Arthur Penhaligon sat on the metal grating, wiping his oily hands on a rag that was arguably dirtier than his hands. He felt drained, as if he had just run a marathon, but for the first time in decades, the persistent ache in his joints was masked by a warm hum of satisfaction. You should charge them more for electricity, Arthur mumbled, staring up at the titanic gears. Now that it's actually stable. Julian laughed. It was a genuine sound, scraping years off his face. I think the shareholders will be happy enough that the city didn't dissolve into a quantum singularity. Julian stood up and offered his hand to Arthur. Come, there is one more thing you need to see. The clock was the emergency. But it isn't the reason you are here. Arthur took the hand. I thought the free flight and the roast chicken were the reason. No, Julian smiled enigmatically. That was just the shipping fee. They left the Cathedral of Brass and took a different elevator. This one didn't go up to the penthouse or down to the lobby. It went sideways, traveling horizontally through the spine of the building into a separate wing of the AI and tower that didn't appear on the public schematics. The doors opened into a long, curved hallway lined with black marble. Soft spotlights illuminated glass cases set into the walls. Arthur walked slowly, his footsteps echoing. He looked into the first case. Inside was a complex mechanical joint, a knee replacement made of titanium and polymer. It looked familiar. The way the joint hinged, the specific angle of the pivot, that is the Van's prosthetic, Julian said, walking beside him. It restored mobility to 3 million veterans last year. It doesn't use motors. It uses a counterweighted gravity system to mimic natural motion. Arthur frowned. It looks like the escapement of the Harrison repeater. It is, Julian nodded. I just scaled it up. Arthur walked to the next case. It displayed the drone, a tiny, hummingbird-like machine used for pollinating crops in areas where bees had gone extinct. The wings beat in a figure-8 pattern. The mainspring design, Arthur whispered, leaning closer to the glass. That's how I taught you to wind the carriage clocks so the tension wouldn't snap the coil. Correct, Julian said. They walked faster now. Case after case. A water filtration system based on the concentric gears of a grandfather clock, a wind turbine engine based on the balance wheel of a pocket watch, a data encryption algorithm visualized as a series of interlocking tumblers, identical to the lock on Arthur's shop safe. Arthur stopped in the middle of the hall. He spun around, looking at the display cases that stretched into the distance. He felt dizzy. I don't understand, Arthur said, his voice trembling. These are billions of dollars of technology. These are patents that change the world. Yes, Julian said calmly. But they are just old clock parts, Arthur protested. They're just the things I showed you on a Tuesday afternoon because we were bored. Julian walked over to a wall at the end of the hall. It was covered in a large digital tapestry, a family tree of inventions. The world thinks I am a visionary, Papa, Julian said, his voice low. They call me the architect of the future. They think I pulled these ideas out of the ether or that an AI generated them. Julian turned to face Arthur. But I didn't invent anything. I just remembered. He tapped the glass of a display case containing a quantum hard drive. When I came to your shop, I was a rat. I was chaos. I was noise. You didn't just feed me, you gave me a framework. You taught me that everything interacts. That if you change one gear here, it affects the lever over there. You taught me consequence. Julian spread his arms, encompassed him the hall, the tower, the city outside. Every machine I built, every solution I found for the world's problems, I just asked myself, how will Arthur fix as if it were a clock? Arthur leaned against the wall for support. The realization washed over him like a tide. For 20 years, he had sat in his rotting shop, believing he was the last of a dying breed. He thought the world had moved on, leaving him behind in the dust. He believed his life had been small, insignificant, and ultimately erased by the digital age. He was wrong. His life hadn't been erased. It had been amplified. His small, dusty lessons, taught by the light of a green lamp to a dirty boy, had been translated into the language of the future. The warmth of his shop was now heating cities. The precision of his hands was now healing the sick. The logic of his mind was now the operating system of civilization. He wasn't obsolete. He was the blueprint. You stole my designs, Arthur joked weakly, trying to keep the tears from spilling over. I should sue you for copyright infringement. I have a better offer, Julian said. He pressed a panel on the wall. The wall slid away, revealing a balcony. Below them, nestled in a hanging garden suspended 1,000 feet above the ocean, was a building. It wasn't a skyscraper. It wasn't a lab. It was a replica. It was a brick-for-brick recreation of Penhaligon's horology. The old shop, the peeling paint, the narrow windows. It looked completely out of place amidst the chrome and glass of New Genesis, a dusty jewel in a platinum setting. I couldn't bring the old building, Julian said apologetically. The developers in Oakhaven were too fast. They bulldozed it yesterday. Arthur felt a pang of grief, but it was fleeting. But I saved the inside, Julian continued. I bought everything. The benches, the tools, the smell. I even paid a chemist to synthesize the scent of the dust. Arthur looked at the little shop sitting in the garden of the sky. Why? Arthur asked. Because I am tired of being the CEO, Julian said. He loosened his tie. I have a board of directors to run the company. I have AIs to manage the logistics. I don't want to attend meetings anymore. Julian looked at Arthur with the eyes of the 12-year-old boy. I want to learn how to fix the bregates and fatigue. You never got to teach me that one. Arthur looked at the man who held the world in his palm, and he saw that the man was still hungry. Not for food, but for the quiet peace of a job well done. It's a difficult mechanism, Arthur warned, sniffing. Very temperamental. I have a good teacher, Julian smiled. And I suppose, Arthur said, straightening his back, that since you are using my intellectual property to run the world, I am entitled to a consulting fee. Name your price, Julian said instantly. Anything. An island. A jet. A new body. Arthur looked at his hands, twisted, old, but still capable of magic. He looked at the little shop. I want my apron, Arthur said, and the cup of tea. Earl Grey. 3 minutes steep. Julian Vance, the titan of industry, bowed his head. Right away, Master Penhaligon. Legacy is not what you leave in a bank account. It is not a statue in a park that pigeons will eventually defile. Legacy is a ripple. It is a stone dropped into the ocean of time, creating waves that continue to travel long after the stone has sunk to the bottom. 3 years had passed since Arthur Penhaligon ascended to the clouds. The replica shop in the hanging gardens of the AI Tower had become a strange legend in the gleaming city of New Genesis. The ultra-rich, the transhumanists, and the data miners would walk past the garden and stare at the little brick building with confusion. They couldn't understand why the most valuable real estate on Earth was occupied by a structure that smelled of mildew and old tea. But inside, time moved at a different pace. Arthur was 85 now. His walking days were mostly behind him. He spent his days in the velvet armchair near the pot-bellied stove, a tartan blanket over his knees. His hands, once the instruments of precision, were now content to hold a cup of Earl Grey. He was no longer the primary mechanic. That role belonged to Julian. It was a sight that baffled the board of directors of AI and Industries. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, the CEO, a man whose signature could shift the GDP of nations, would cancel all meetings. He would turn off his Neuralink. He would take off his $4,000 suit, put on a leather apron stained with grease, and sit at the workbench. Julian fixed the watches. Arthur fixed the philosophy. You're rushing the balance wheel, Arthur would croak from his chair, his eyes closed. I haven't even touched it yet, Julian would reply, smiling. I can hear your breathing, Arthur said. You are breathing in, digital. Breathe in, analog. In and out. But this shop was not just a clubhouse for two men. It was a seedbed. On this particular morning, the bell above the door chimed. It wasn't a customer. The door opened, and 6 children walked in. They did not look like the citizens of New Genesis. They were not wearing smart suits or augmented reality glasses. They wore mismatched clothes. They were thin. Their eyes were wide, darting around the room, expecting to be chased away. They were from the low zones, the forgotten slums at the base of the tower, where the shadows of the skyscrapers blocked out the sun. Julian stood up from the bench. He wiped his hands on a rag. Welcome, Julian said gently. Come in. Don't touch the stove. It's hot. The children shuffled forward. A little girl in the front, no older than 10, pointed a dirty finger at the wall of ticking clocks. "What are they for?" she asked suspiciously. "Do they mind Bructo?" Arthur chuckled from his chair. The sound was like dry wood crackling. "No, little one. They don't take anything. They only tell you where you are." Julian walked over to the group. "This is the first class of the Penhaligon Institute," he announced to Arthur. "We aren't teaching them to code. We aren't teaching them to be efficient. What are we teaching them?" Arthur asked, his eyes twinkling. "We are teaching them how to fix broken things," Julian said. He looked at the children, seeing his own reflection in their grime-streaked faces. "We are teaching them that being broken is not the end. It's just an opportunity for repair." The class began. It was chaotic at first. Screws were dropped. Springs flew across the room like angry insects. But slowly, the magic took hold. The rhythm of the room settled. The children stopped shaking. They found that their small, nimble fingers, fingers that the world had deemed useless, were perfect for manipulating the tiny brass hearts of the machines. Arthur watched them. He saw the focus in their eyes. He saw the moment the fear evaporated, replaced by the intoxication of competence. He realized then that the transaction he had made 25 years ago in a rainy alleyway was finally complete. He had saved one boy. That boy had saved a city. And now, together, they were saving the next generation. The iron rain had stopped. Or rather, it had changed. It was no longer a cold, hard thing that beat you down. It was water for the soil. As the sun began to set, turning the glass city into a kaleidoscope of orange and purple, the children laughed, clutching their toolkits like treasures. Julian locked the door. He made a fresh pot of tea. He brought a cup to Arthur. Arthur took it, but his hand was heavy. He sat it down on the saucer. "Julian," Arthur whispered. "Yes, Papa." Julian pulled up a stool and sat close. "The Harrison repeater," Arthur said, his voice faint. "The one you fixed that night. Do you remember what was wrong with it?" "It was the detent lever," Julian said instantly. "It was bent by a fraction of a degree. It was catching on the gear." Arthur smiled. "No, that's what was wrong with the machine." "But do you know why it stopped?" Julian frowned. "Why?" "It was tired," Arthur sighed, closing his eyes. "It had counted enough minutes. It had done its duty. It needed to rest before it could sing again." Julian went still. The silence in the room stretched out, filled only by the ticking of 100 clocks. Tick, tock, tick, tock. "Arthur?" Julian's voice cracked. Arthur didn't open his eyes. He felt light. The pain in his joints was fading, replaced by a sensation of floating, like he was in the elevator, rising through the clouds. "You are a good boy, 7, Arthur whispered. "You are the finest mechanism I ever built. Keep them winding. Don't let them rust." "I won't," Julian said, tears spilling onto his apron. "I promise." Arthur Penhaligon took a breath. It was a long, slow breath, syncing with the pendulum of the grandfather clock in the corner. And then, between one tick and the next, he simply stopped. There was no alarm, no catastrophe. The clocks on the wall didn't stop. They continued to march forward, indifferent and faithful. Julian sat there for a long time as the twilight deepened into night. He held the old man's hand until it grew cool. He didn't scream. He didn't rage at the universe. He knew better. He knew that Arthur wasn't gone. He looked at the display cases in the hallway outside, the prosthetics, the engines, the clean energy grids. He looked at the empty stools where the children had sat today. Arthur was everywhere. He was in the rhythm of the city. He was in the beat of the AI and core. He was in the hands of the children who would build the next century. Julian stood up. He gently covered Arthur with a tartan blanket. He walked to the workbench. He picked up the tweezers. He picked up a small, broken watch that one of the students had left behind. He put the loop to his thigh. He leaned in. Tick, tock. The work continued. If you go to Mu Genesis today, you will see the AI tower piercing the clouds. You will see a world of miracles, where hunger is a memory and energy is free. But if you look closely, if you look past the holograms and the prom, you will see the truth. You will see it in the statue that stands in the central plaza. It is not the statue of a conqueror or a king. It is a bronze statue of an old man in a rumpled suit, holding an umbrella over a shivering boy. And at the base of the statue, etched into the metal, are words that every child in this city knows by heart. Invest in the broken, for they are the ones who know how to fix the world. And if you stand there, in the silence of the early morning, and you listen very, very closely, you can still hear it. Tick, tock. The echo of a kindness that never ends.